I want to ask you something before we get into this. When you think about the films that shaped science fiction, the ones that built the genre into what it is today, what comes to mind? Star Wars, probably. 2001, A Space Odyssey. Alien, maybe Blade Runner. A handful of films from the late 60s through to the early 80s that collectively decided what sci-fi was allowed to look like, sound like, and feel like. Now here's the question I couldn't stop thinking about when I started researching this video. What if one of those films had been led by a woman? Not a woman in the background, not a woman in a supporting role, not a woman who exists to motivate the male hero, but a woman at the absolute center of the story. The one with agency and the courage, the one the whole film is built around. Because that film existed. It came out in 1968. It had a huge budget, a major studio behind it, one of the most famous actresses in the world in the lead role, and a visual imagination that was genuinely ahead of its time. And Hollywood looked at it, got nervous, and turned it into a joke. Welcome back. I'm Sam, and today we're talking about Barbarella, the 1968 space adventure that starred Jane Fonda, cost a fortune, pushed the boundaries of what science fiction cinema looked like, and then got buried under decades of camp reputation and nervous laughter. A film that, in a different cultural moment, with a studio willing to take its own heroines seriously, might have changed the trajectory of the entire genre. This is the story of why that didn't happen, why Hollywood had a blueprint for the female-led space epic 9 years before Star Wars and didn't know what to do with it. Who made the decisions that turned a potential myth into a curiosity? And what the film's complicated legacy tells us about an industry that has always been more comfortable with women as decoration than as heroes. I've been thinking about this film for a long time, and the more I've looked into it, the more I've come to believe that what happened to Barbarella isn't just interesting film history. It's a story that explains something important about how the genre we love got shaped and who got left out of it. Before we talk about what went wrong, I want to make sure we're clear on what Barbarella actually was, because I think most people, if they know the film at all, know it through its reputation rather than its reality. Barbarella began as a French comic strip created by Jean-Claude Forest, first published in 1962, and the character Forrest created was genuinely radical for her time, not in a provocative look at this way, but in a quietly revolutionary one. She was a space explorer, an agent of a future Earth government, traveling the galaxy on missions that required courage, intelligence, and resourcefulness. She was competent, she was curious, she took the lead in every situation she encountered, and she was never, at any point in the source material, the passive object of someone else's story. She was also sexual, confidently, without shame. And this is where things get complicated, because that sexuality is the lens through which Hollywood chose to see everything else about her. Not as one dimension of a fully realized character, but as the whole point, the thing that defined her, the thing the film would be sold on. When Dino De Laurentiis acquired the rights to adapt the comic and brought in Roger Vadim to direct, Vadim being, notably, Jane Fonda's husband at the time, the creative decisions that followed were shaped almost entirely by that framing. The production design was extraordinary. The visual imagination was genuinely ambitious. The film that emerged had a scale and a strangeness that no American studio would have attempted, but somewhere between Forrest's original vision and the finished film, something was lost. The adventure got buried under the spectacle, the character got buried under the image, and the marketing buried everything else. When Paramount released Barbarella in America in 1968, the campaign leaned so hard into the sexual spectacle that the actual substance of what the film contained, the world building, the adventure structure, the genuine weirdness of its imagination barely registered. Audiences came expecting titillation and got something far stranger and more interesting, and many of them didn't know what to make of it. That confusion was not an accident. It was the result of a studio that looked at a female-led sci-fi epic and decided the safest way to sell it was to make sure nobody took it seriously as a sci-fi epic at all. If you want more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what movie you want me to cover next. Here's something I find genuinely fascinating about this film, and I don't think it gets discussed enough. Jane Fonda was, by 1968, a serious actress. not yet the cultural icon she would become that came later through the work she did in the 70s and the political stands she took during the Vietnam War. But she had already demonstrated in films like The Chase and Barefoot in the Park that she had genuine range and genuine presence. She was not a performer who needed to be hidden behind spectacle, and yet Barbarella was sold almost entirely on her body and almost not at all on her talent. The opening sequence, the zero-gravity striptease that plays over the credits, set the tone not just for the film, but for the way the industry and the press would talk about it for decades. Before Barbarella had said a single line of dialogue, or shown a single moment of the courage and intelligence that actually defines her in the story, audiences were being told what she was for. Fonda has spoken about this film in interviews across the years, with a mixture of affection and complicated feelings that I think is completely understandable. She was young, she was in a marriage with her director, she was working within a system that had very specific ideas about what a woman in her position was supposed to do and be. The agency she had over her own image was limited in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. But what strikes me most when I think about her performance, actually watching the film, paying attention to what she's doing, is how much is there that the marketing actively worked to obscure. There's a genuine playfulness in how she plays Barbarella, a warmth, a physical confidence that goes beyond the obvious. She understood this character in ways the promotional campaign never acknowledged and the critical reception largely ignored. Fonda went on to win 2 Academy Awards. She became one of the defining actresses of her generation, and Barbarella became a footnote, a camp curio, a poster on a student's wall, a reference point for a certain kind of knowing retro irony. I think about the gap between what her performance actually contains and what the world decided to see, and I think that gap is the whole story of this film in miniature. I want to make an argument here that I think is genuinely worth sitting with, even if it sounds a little counterfactual. Barbarella came out in 1968. Star Wars came out in 1977. In the 9 years between those two films, Hollywood had a female-led space adventure with a massive budget, a visionary production design, a genuinely mythic source material, and one of the most compelling actresses of the era at its center. And instead of treating it as the beginning of something, instead of asking what it would mean to build a franchise, an entire visual language around a woman who travels the stars and drives her own story, the industry shrugged and moved on. Think about what Star Wars did. It created a universe, it created a mythology, it gave audiences heroes to believe in, and a visual grammar for what space adventure could look like. And it did all of that with a male hero at its center, following the oldest story structure in existence. Barbarella had already done something stranger and more interesting. It had built a world around a woman who didn't need saving, who didn't exist in relation to a male hero, who moved through the universe on her own terms. The imagination was there. What wasn't there was a studio willing to say, this is the blueprint, this is what we build on. Instead, the film was treated as a one-off, a novelty, something to be mildly embarrassed about while also quietly profiting from. And the female-led space epic had to wait, and wait, and wait. You could argue, and I find this argument genuinely compelling, that the decision to treat Barbarella as camp rather than myth didn't just affect this one film. It shaped the next decade of science fiction cinema. It told a generation of filmmakers and studio executives that women couldn't anchor this kind of story seriously, that the audience for serious space adventure was male, that a female hero in that space would always be a joke, or a pin-up, or a supporting character, but never the myth. That assumption didn't get seriously challenged until Ripley in 1979. And even then, it took another decade and another Alien film before a woman got to be the kind of full-scale action hero that male stars had been playing since the genre began. Barbarella was there first, and the industry decided not to notice. There's a specific kind of damage that happens to a film when the people selling it don't believe in it, and I think Barbarella is one of the clearest examples of it I've come across. The anxiety was visible in every marketing decision Paramount made. The posters led with Fonda's body. The taglines were winking and dismissive. The press coverage was full of a particular kind of condescension. The tone of people who think they're being sophisticated by treating something as camp, when actually they're just revealing that they have no framework for taking it seriously. And here's what I think is the most damaging part of that. The film that was actually made was not a pure camp exercise. There are sequences in Barbarella, the Angel with broken wings, the City of Night, the final confrontation with the Great Tyrant that have a genuine surreal power. The production design by Mario Garbuglia has an inventiveness that holds up. The world it builds is genuinely strange in ways that feel earned rather than arbitrary. But none of that is what the audience was prepared for. They were prepared for a joke. And when you're prepared for a joke, you laugh at everything, even the things that aren't trying to be funny. The marketing didn't just set expectations. It built a lens through which the entire film would be seen, and that lens has proved almost impossible to remove in the 50+ years since. I've talked to people who've watched Barbarella for the first time as adults, people who came to it through film history rather than its camp reputation, and almost all of them say the same thing. They expected something cheap and throwaway. What they found was something far more genuinely ambitious. And more than a little sad, because you can feel throughout it the gap between what it was reaching for and how it was going to be received. That gap is the result of marketing anxiety, of a studio that had something genuinely interesting and couldn't find the confidence to sell it honestly, and the film has been paying for that ever since. Here's where I land on Barbarella's legacy, and I want to be honest about the complexity of it. The camp reputation is not entirely unfair. There are things in this film that are genuinely irreducibly silly. The acting in places is broad. Some of the set pieces belong to a different, lighter register than the film sometimes seems to be aiming for. Vadim was not a director with a clear, singular vision. He was a filmmaker who moved between registers without always managing the transitions. These are real limitations. But I've become increasingly impatient with the way that camp reputation has been used as an excuse not to think seriously about what this film was doing and what it represented. Because the silliness and the ambition coexist in Barbarella, and dismissing the whole thing because of the silliness means you miss the ambition entirely. And ambition matters. It matters because Barbarella is one of the first major studio attempts to build a science fiction epic around a female protagonist who has genuine agency, who is not defined by her relationship to a man, who drives the narrative through her own choices, who exists as the hero rather than the reward. That was radical in 1968. It remains rarer than it should be today. When I watch the films that eventually did what Barbarella was reaching for, when I watch Ripley or Furiosa or the women at the center of the best recent science fiction, I think about the 9 years between Barbarella and Star Wars, I think about what might have been built in that gap if the industry had been willing to look at what it already had and take it seriously. We would have had a different genre, a richer one that had been asking for nearly a decade longer what science fiction looks like when the person at its center is a woman who matters. We didn't get that. We got a poster, we got a camp classic, we got decades of knowing winks and ironic appreciation. I'm not saying that's nothing, but I am saying it's much less than what was possible. Barbarella has never quite gone away. And I find that genuinely interesting. Because films with its kind of reputation, the slightly embarrassed camp classic, the thing people reference more than they actually watch, usually fade. They become answers to film trivia questions. They stop circulating, but Barbarella keeps coming back. There have been multiple announced remakes over the decades, none of which have made it to production. There have been stage adaptations, comic revivals, fashion references, cultural touchstones. Something about the character refuses to be fully buried under the camp reputation, and I think it's because the core of what she represents is too potent to disappear entirely. A woman in space, free, capable, curious, unashamed, driving her own story, those are not small things. And the fact that Hollywood keeps announcing it wants to revisit this material while consistently failing to actually make the version the material deserves is its own kind of commentary on the industry's relationship with female heroes. Every few years, a new director or a new studio gets attached to a Barbarella remake. every few years it falls apart. And meanwhile, the original sits there imperfect, undermined, more interesting than its reputation allows, waiting for an audience willing to see past the wink and find what's underneath it. Here's where I've landed with Barbarella after all of this research, all of this thinking. I don't think it's a great film. I think it's an interesting one, genuinely, fascinatingly interesting in ways that its reputation actively works against. But great? No. The limitations are real, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone. What I do think is that it's one of the most revealing films I've ever spent time with, because the gap between what it is and what it could have been is so visible, so clearly the result of specific decisions made by specific people in a specific cultural moment, that it functions almost as a document, evidence of exactly how an industry's assumptions about women shape what gets made and how it gets seen. Barbarella didn't fail because Jane Fonda wasn't compelling enough, or because the source material wasn't rich enough, or because audiences weren't ready. It failed because the people with the power to shape how it was seen decided, before anyone had a chance to find out, that a woman in space couldn't be taken seriously. If you want more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what movie you want me to cover next. See you in the next video.